A critic is a creature who has views quite like a camel's. Flowers and fruit he scorns. In the flower garden of the honeyed muse, he starves unless he finds a meal of thorns. Welcome to A Meal of Thorns, a critical book club from the Enslayer Review of Books. I'm Jake Brookins. Each episode, we look at a book, sometimes old, sometimes new, sometimes obscure, sometimes wildly successful, and we ask a critic, writer, scholar, reader of some variety to tell us what's fascinating about this, what's troubling or provocative about it, what does it say to or about the field. Today we are talking about N.K. Jemisin's The Fifth Season, and I am so happy to introduce our guest, Dr. Joy Sanchez-Taylor. Joy is a professor at CUNY LaGuardia who specializes in science fiction, fantasy, and critical race studies. Her first book, Diverse Futures, Science Fiction and Authors of Color, is a fantastic resource. I see it cited all the time. And she's got chapters and essays and reviews all kinds of places, including Strange Horizons, Extrapolation, and the Routledge Handbook of Co-Futurisms. Her new book, Dispelling Fantasies, Authors of Color Reimagine a Genre, is hot off the press. Joy, thanks so much for joining. How are you?
Great. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this is really exciting. I was looking for someone. I've been wanting to talk about Jemisin for a bit, and so this works out perfectly with your book coming out. Before we dive into The Broken Earth, what else have you been reading? Anything cool?
Actually, yeah, I'm just about to finish. I know people can't see this, but I'll show you. E.B. Zuboy's book Skin. That is also hot off the press, but it is a fantastic fantasy young adult book written in verse.
Okay.
But easy to read. That's difficult to do. But it is based on the myth of the Sokoyant, which is a really cool Caribbean folklore figure, sometimes called the Logaru, sometimes called the Hag. It's basically typically a female figure who can detach the top half of her body from the bottom half. And then the top half goes around flying around, making mischief and eating unborn children. So it's a really fascinating folklore, and Zuboy has done a fantastic job of translating it for this generation of readers. I'm going to teach it in my Latino literature class, and I'm really excited about it.
Oh, that's cool. That's really rad. That's Skin?
Skin.
What's the name of the creature that detaches the top half again?
Generally, I see it called the Sokoyant, but also the Logaru or Hag.
I'm not going to be able to remember now, but I read a short story somewhere featuring that, and I thought that was really fascinating. So, oh, that's cool. I've heard that I can't speak to this authoritatively, but I've heard that there's been like a little bit of a movement of verse novels in like YA spaces. I don't know if you know more about that than I do, but just I've heard that a little bit. So
I have not. This is the first verse novel in fantasy that I've read, and I actually really loved it. I think it's, so interestingly written, yet so accessible. I absolutely love that, especially for young readers and students.
Yeah, that's really, really cool. All right, I will rack my brain. I'll look up and put in the notes. I swear I've heard of a couple others in that field, and I feel bad I can't remember them right now. But I've been reading mostly short story collections right now because I've been traveling a bunch, and those work well because I can just kind of down one when I have a space. I'm right in the middle of Liliana Kalanzi's "You Glow in the Dark." I don't know if you've heard of this one.
I have not.
Translated by, I don't have it in front of me. Oh dear, Chris Andrews, I think is the translator.
Okay.
But it's sort of like, I don't want to slap a genre label on it, but it's in the like weird slipstream, maybe magical realist kind of range. Very disturbing. I've really been enjoying them. It has these really vivid images, and the title story is kind of built around the Goiânia radiological accident. I don't know if you know about this.
No.
It's like one of the most terrifying stories to me. I happen to know about it before I picked this collection up, where I don't remember all the details, but it was this medical facility that was being demolished, had like improperly disposed of this radioactive material that like people looking for like metal salvage found later, and it did horrible radiological things to people. But anyways, that's always been a story that has horrified me. And so to have it like handled by someone who's really like masterful short storyteller is really, really upsetting in a good way. So, but let's go ahead and jump into this book. So today we are talking about N.K. Jemisin's The Fifth Season. This was published by Orbit in 2015. I'm not going to classify it as science fiction or fantasy right this second. We'll probably talk about that more. But it is set on a world that is racked by periodic seasons of seismic disaster, and the people and civilizations there have made a variety of adaptations to survive. And some people, the Origines, have the ability to control earthquakes and do lots of other cool stuff. Split into 3 narratives, the novel follows Essen, an Origine who sets out to avenge her son and rescue her daughter after a massive cataclysm. Demaya, a young girl who is inducted into a kind of school for Origines. And Cyanite, a powerful Origine ordered to accompany an older and even more powerful Origine, Alabaster, and the two of them wind up getting into lots of complicated situations. The 5th season was followed by The Obelisk Gate in 2016 and The Stone Sky in 2017. All 3 of those novels won the Hugo Award, which is the first time that has ever happened. A decade later, the 5th season and the trilogy as a whole continue to stand as one of the most important entries in recent speculative fiction. So I was curious, as we're getting into this, what your relationship with this book is. If you remember when you first encountered it, or if you have any sort of like particular stance or relationship to it.
Yeah, actually, I mean, I think I read it shortly after it came out because I was doing research for my first book, Diverse Futures, which, as you said, is about science fiction and authors of color. So I was very curious. And of course, winning the Hugo Award 3 years in a row definitely made it a series that I had to read. And I remember reading it and absolutely loving it. And then I got the chance to actually interview Jemisin at an event that was happening in New York City in 2019 over at the Queen's Museum. They were doing a really cool event called Alternate Worlds. And I got the chance to talk to her, and I was so excited, such a fan of the series. And of course, she is one of those authors, like whenever I meet an author like N.K. Jemisin or Sylvia Moreno Garcia, they're my people, but we're all like standing there awkwardly, like I would so much rather be at home in my pajamas reading right now. That I can totally understand that mindset. So it was kind of an awkward talk after the interview, but I loved it and I love her work. And I've also not taught the series, but I've led reading groups run by the Center for Fiction. It's a private library here in Brooklyn in New York City. So I did that twice where I had these wonderful groups of readers who were reading the series in real time, and I was there to provide sort of the context, sort of like what you do here, basically. And we had some great conversations about the series.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah. My relationship with this book, this book and this trilogy, to me, they almost stand in for me for like my personal like readerly relationship with current and contemporary work. I encountered this right after it came out. I was in Chicago. I was in a bunch of book clubs, and this was one of the first like. I mean, I had been reading other recent stuff, but this is one of the first times where I read like a really buzzy book right when it came out, and then was really bowled over by it. I think I had read at least I'd read a chunk of both of her earlier series and liked them, but this one really bowled me over. And then watching this, we don't need to go super long on it, but watching this win and then do this like hat trick of winning all 3 right in like the aftermath of the whole puppy phenomenon in science fiction spaces.
Oh, yes.
Just to me, like cemented, like first off, having this, like these books, they have a lot of things that science fiction and fantasy fans will recognize, but they're not a copy of anything that's come earlier. They feel like they're a little different shape. They're really great. And then also they felt like they were very much a part of this conversation going on that, it's not, those conversations have happened earlier, but I wasn't aware of them. So it was one of those things where like I was like watching the sort of fanish news about what was going on with the Hugos and with Puppygate and all that stuff, and then reading these fantastic books. So they kind of like live in that like bridge between literary phenomena and like the larger social phenomena around them for me, and they kind of stand in for that.
Yeah, and I have to shout out Jemisin's 2018 Hugo acceptance speech. If people haven't watched it, you have to watch it. It was epic. She called out exactly what was happening and explained exactly why.
Also, I should mention two things. One is that I realized after this was set up that I biffed it because the podcast, we have this soft kind of joking thing that we do the middle volume of trilogies. And I was like, oh, shoot, we should have done the middle volume of the trilogy. But it's okay. We did the first one. And the other thing I just like to say for readers is that we're not going to try to spoil this for you, but we're also not going to avoid it. Probably spoil some stuff. It's been out for 10 years. Go read it.
Yeah.
I want to start just kind of asking if you have any thoughts, if you're interested, and the answer can be no, on where this sits generically.
Yes. One of my favorite things about Jemisin is that she is she has fun when she's writing in a very irreverent way. And she has said in interviews multiple times, so I'm not surprised by this, that she doesn't care where the line is between science fiction and fantasy. She's actually questioned multiple times, like, why do people care so much about where this line is? Now, as an academic, that's hard for me because I'm supposed to care where the line is. But I also absolutely love writing that mashes genres.
Mm-hmm.
So in a sense, I understand what she's saying. I also don't care sometimes where the line is. I just want people to write what works, right? To write what their story, no matter how you do that. And so I see like her, Jemisin and Nnedi Okorafor and a lot of these, uh, you know, female women of color, speculative authors really questioning that and really saying, look, sorry, that was old school. We don't have to pay attention to the line. We can blur the line, we can mess with the line, and that's okay. And it's going to result in great writing. So, but I do think that was one of the reasons people were a little bit upset about the Hugo wins because she does mess with it, and I won't spoil it for people, but after book one, people thought this was a science fiction series.
Mm-hmm.
They thought it was a straight up dystopic future science fiction series. And then in book two, she straight up messes with that.
Yep. I mean, I'm of the same sort of double mindset as you, where like I really love work that doesn't think about genre and care about genres as doing its own thing. I also love categorizing and thinking about it, and especially because not just because, I have an encyclopedic brain or something like that, but because genre rules are part of how a writer signals to you that they kind of know the tradition you're coming from and they're doing things with it. And one of the things I just love about this, and coming back, when I first read these, and we could talk about this more too, but I was really struck by the clarity and the anger in these books. But coming back to this time, the playfulness jumped out at me a lot more. And the playfulness is not on the it's not like there's quirky dialogue and lots of puns or something like that, but there's this sort of meta level playfulness with genre where Jemisin's kind of thumbing her nose at everyone who loves drawing genre lines, right? Because like you crack open the book and it's got, a map of a fantasy kingdom, right?
Yeah.
But then you go in there and it's like, oh, it's actually like more a dystopia. And so it's thought through how a dystopia will work. And that's a very science fiction thing to do. But then there are wizards that show up. And the wizards start doing wizardy things. And you're like, okay, it's clearly fantasy. But then Jemisin explains that how the origins the wizards work is all based on like solid biological and thermodynamic and tectonic principles. And you're like, oh, okay, it's science fiction. And it keeps alternating back and forth like that, right? And I love that. And yeah, as you say, in the second and third book, she puts like a big capital M messing with you right into it. So it's great.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. And I think a lot of that comes from, Jemisin being frustrated with the sort of limitations that are very often placed on new writers when they write in a specific genre. If you write in one genre, you should stay in that genre. If you write a first book, it has to become a trilogy or it has to become a 12-book series. Authors are, I hear them talk about in their interviews that pressure to continue to produce something similar and to continue to stay in their lane so they have an audience. And I think N.K. Jemisin got tired and said, I don't want to do that at all. And keeping in mind that one of her earlier series that I actually write about for my new project, the Inheritance trilogy, that's straight up fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't surprise me. It surprised me more that people came into the Broken Earth trilogy thinking that she wasn't going to do that. Yeah, she's all over the place. And even in her City That Became series, that's more like urban fantasy. So she's all over the map, but I love that. Like authors like her and Sylvia Moreno Garcia and Nevo, like we need more of that authors writing across genres because it not only does it, work and it's awesome and it makes them happy, but it makes them more money and more of an audience. And that will keep them working.
I think too part of what I like so much about that sort of meta level play is that so this novel is doing quite a few things that are a little different from the previous kind of like Hugo award winning books you might have got right before it. But one of the things that it's doing that I really like, and it's doing it across the whole trilogy, is doing some really thoughtful stylistic things that are not super in your face, right? Like there are very upfront, right in your face things in this book that are really potent and powerful. And I think that's what it's what grabs you, it's what you think about it, and that's great. But it's also doing these things like the genre play, like the viewpoints that she's messing around with, right? Where she has like a third of this book is told in second person, which is pretty unusual to do at that length, and I think it works really well. It's doing this, it's funny coming back to it now, having already known that the three viewpoints converge and are one person because it feels obvious. But the first time I read this, I remember, and I noted them when I was reading it this time, these specific points where you're like, oh, these two characters are actually the same. And then a little later, oh, these three characters, all three of them are actually the same. She has, over the trilogy, she's kind of thought about some of those both like, meta genre or kind of world building details. She's thought about how that comes together across the whole thing. And she's also thought about how keeping this sort of triple braided voice is going to work in a way that I just think that's really fun. And I think it's great. I always applaud when like big best-selling award-winning stuff is doing interesting things stylistically as well as like on the idea level. And I think this is doing both. That was kind of fun to come back to. I'd forgotten a little how clever the books were. I remember how good they were, but I'd forgotten some of the cleverness.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It's funny because, I was teaching this in reading groups where people would sign up because they were sort of interested, but maybe they weren't hardcore sci-fi fantasy fans. And one of the complaints I would get about the series, if anybody complained, was that it could be hard to follow because it's got multiple storylines going on, multiple points of view, and then the characters' names change. But I've always told people, look, if you can read Game of Thrones, if you can read A Wheel of Time, you can read the Broken Earth series, and it's worth it because they're amazing books. But yeah, she has a lot of fun with it.
I've thought a lot about something I think a lot about reading is sort of like maybe like televisual influence on how
Mm.
stories are told. And it is interesting how this one is doing, yeah, if you can read Game of Thrones, you can read this, which is bounced around. But this one is doing so much more, at least in the first one, doing so much more chronological movement as well, where you're not just jumping viewpoints and jumping names, but you're jumping times in a way that's not super obvious at first, which I don't have anything clever to say about, but I dig. I think it also points to how even though there is one, you sort of learn an overarching thing about how this trilogy is going to work in the first one. But the first one doesn't really have like a classic fantasy or sci-fi quest, right?
Exactly.
We know that Essen like wants to track down and save her daughter. But other than that, the other viewpoints, they initially don't have a lot of control over what they're doing. You're just kind of getting all these different angles on this larger world. It feels very compelling in each chapter, but when you kind of step back from it, it's like, oh, like they're not seeking an artifact yet. They're not like they don't have a quest.
It's interesting, yeah, because what she's doing in book one is sort of, yeah, classic sci-fi fantasy, but also not. It's classic in that it's the setup. And lots of sci-fi fantasy series, you got to read the first book or the first three books just to be able to get a sense of the world. But also, I think, one of the big reasons that she is doing it the way that she's doing it is to get away from the hero's journey. Because
Mm,
one of the big themes that I'm most interested in this book is, the ways that she sort of uses fantasy and science fiction to point out systemic oppression. And that works, if you get away from the hero's journey, and in the classic fantasy book, the hero would come into their abilities, and that would signal that they're ready to go on the quest to save the world. But in Jemisin's world, and in the worlds of a lot of other authors that I write about for my new book project, that doesn't happen. That even when you have these incredible abilities, even when you have communities of people with these incredible abilities, they still can't save the world because of systemic oppression.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was really cool how she does that. Also, Tomi Adeyemi's Children of Blood and Bones series, and a new one that I really enjoyed, Moses Osei Utomi's Lies of the Ajungo
Oh, yeah.
series. I can see across these authors as I'm researching for, dispelling fantasies, that they're questioning that hero's journey. Like, if you're one person and you're of a certain race or of a certain ethnicity or a certain group, can you really save the world?
Oh boy, if we start talking about Itomi, I'm worried we're going to talk the whole time. Those books are so
Good.
they're so good. They're I don't want to say they're without hope because they're not without hope,
Hmm.
but they're also like so much bleaker and heavier than I anticipated.
Yeah.
And just well, so something that those books have in common with this trilogy, I think, is how good they are at identifying the structure and the system as the problem,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, so this is like question mark, is this far in the future of Earth? Is it a fully secondary Earth? Not sure. Not really that interested in that. But Jemisin hasn't just set up an allegory for, simple race or class divisions that happen today, right? It's not just that like there is a villain that needs to be defeated or even like, a society that needs to be defeated. It's looking at the way that these imperial and colonial and systems of oppression are like baked into all these different systems and having this immense clarity and anger about that and wanting and knowing that like something needs to be torn down first. That I just think is really, really effective. I am extremely, extremely tired of all the Omelas takes out there, but the Omelas take that's baked into this one, I really dig. Right, where Alabaster and Cyanite, slash our main character, really highlighting the way that this is a society that is fundamentally plugged into and runs on suffering, right, and runs on
Mm-hmm.
causing pain and extracting value from people, not treating them as people, and that the solution is not to walk away, but is to do something dramatic about it. And I really dig that. And I think it's one of the reasons I think this book works so well and also like frustrated people in good ways is how it doesn't have one-to-one. Yeah, it doesn't have one-to-one allegories or metaphors about how things work in our world, but you can see that like this is a raced oppression. It doesn't exactly map to the kinds of categories we're used to. This is a classed oppression. It doesn't necessarily apply to the kinds of class and the societies we're used to, but
Yeah, it's really interesting. And that's one of the things I think that frustrates fans sometimes and frustrates the authors too, because I remember a lot of this talk with Octavia Butler as well, that very often critics want to say, yes, this is slavery. And sometimes the authors are like, hey, this is a little bit more complex than that. I know Octavia Butler was very adamant about that. But I do love that N.K. Jemisin comes in with a stick and just beats you over the head. And she is like, this is oppression. This is slavery. Here it is. And she's not shy about it. And, I find that necessary. Like a lot of times, sometimes people will say, well, it's too obvious or too heavy handed. And I don't, that's why they don't like it. But I think we're living in a time where people need that. You need to be beat over the head with it and then beat over the head with it again. And Jemisin is so good at that, but then also getting into those little pockets of hope that she creates throughout the series where Essun finds joy in things, generally taken away after that. But, she does leave the possibility of hope, which is important.
yeah, I was thinking through this about its connection to kind of utopian science fiction, which is a funny thing to say about something that's like right very close to a dystopia for the bulk of it. But the willingness to kind of like put on the page the seriousness of the problem and what we might need to do about it
Mm.
as part of how it sort of earns those islands of comfort that it gets,
Mm.
which I really, really dig. There's a lot of I don't want to dunk on like cozy fantasy or something like that, but there's a lot of work that has politics I generally agree with, or maybe like worlds that seem like a pleasant place to be,
Mm.
but it's not clear how we could ever get to there.
Right.
And
Hmm.
it's not that this is obviously not a roadmap because we're not wizards, most of us, but that this knows that to get to a better place, we're going to have to like tear down these old systems, and it's really clear about that.
Yeah, I do love that. I think authors take one of two approaches that I've been seeing across, when I've been doing my research. They either make the point that, having magic doesn't necessarily mean you can save the world, or they use the magic in a way that is decolonial, like comes in and sort of, tries to fix the issue, but in a way that gives power to marginalized groups. So I really love that idea. And I tell my students all the time when I teach fantasy texts, you know, the magic is not frivolous. The
Mm,
magic is there in order for you to either see the system of oppression more clearly or to give power back to the communities that have lost power. And either way the author chooses to do it, it points out the inequity, which
mm-hmm.
very often, because I also do a lot of work in teaching and university, yeah, schools and DEI and all of that. And very often people will sort of blame the marginalized community for not advancing because, you should just pull yourself up by your bootstraps and become successful. And including magic makes it very clear that even the most powerful person cannot succeed if the system is stacked against them. And Jemisin does that so well.
One thing I was thinking when I was looking through this for kind of those rays of hope, like those sort of like possible positive ways forward, additionally to like the negative steps we need to take, was, and one of the things that I think is kind of like thorny and kind of interesting to come back to and kind of problematic when I'm thinking through it, is the survivalist mentality in these books is very strong, right?
Mm.
Like all of these, the cultures and the people that are still around are the people that have figured out how to repeatedly survive these catastrophes, right? And it's one of those, that's another one of those places where like the needle is swinging between fantasy and science fiction because it's like, oh,
Mm.
some of these like, no, you totally couldn't have survived that. I'm like, oh, that one, no, you probably could if you were really smart about it. Like, oh, that one, I don't know. That one, yeah. But this idea that there's the stone lore, right, which are these
Mm-hmm.
these rules that have written down, and they have been modified over time, but they're how you survive. You have to do this, and this idea that like everyone that we meet here, at least in the sort of the margins and the peripheries and the smaller communities, they are all in sort of a scarcity precarity mindset,
Mm.
and this idea that like only what survives is right is like an idea that is
Mm.
in the books. But that's a very problematic, troublesome ideology, right? That is often used by powerful people to justify taking even more away. And I think there are like threads of showing the contradiction of that here. And one of them being the communities and seeing that like there are actually different ways to do things. And one of them being, I think, the ambivalence toward the dead civilizations that sort of like are
Mm.
scattered around. Which, by the way, just as a kind of like world building genre trope thing, I love the dead civ thing. And
Mm-hmm.
like you're reading this thing, and I'm like, maybe it's a fantasy, maybe it's a science fiction, and then suddenly it has this sort of like, I don't know, to me, very like sword and sorcery, like I don't know, like Saunders, Conan kind of thing going on. Of like, yeah, these dead civs. But there are people who are really dismissive of them and just saying, like, well, whatever it was that they were, they didn't survive, so they're not worthy, right?
Mm.
And just dismissive. But then there are other people who say, no, like they were a way that worked for a long way, and maybe they did things that are differently than us. Maybe we could think about that. I really dig that. And part of, Essen discovering these communities that are not prejudiced towards origins is that idea that, like, yeah, there are different ways we could run society.
Yeah, yeah, one of the things that I really like about it is that, well, I mean, honestly, it reads different now than it did when I first read it.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, because you see that starting to happen again. The economy is terrible right now, and you see people starting to hoard resources and prices going up, and it just intensely makes me think of Jemisin's world here, and the first rule of stone lore is first you close the gate.
Yeah.
And how in the US we're doing that right now. So yes, it is very, very pertinent. And every time I read Jemisin, it makes me think of Octavia Butler and the way that people have said that her Parable series was, almost magical in its way to predict the future. And, it's not magic. She just read the news and then extrapolated what could happen. And Jemisin has done the same with both the scarcity mindset and climate change.
Yeah.
In this book, and it's pretty incredible, and it reads a lot scarier now.
Yeah, the sort of like eco-fascist undertones of how this whole thing works is really in your face. And again, it's one of those thorny things where I think it's for all its clarity, and that's a word I've used a bunch, and it's sort of its anger and its vision of how we need to attack oppressive systems. There are a lot of levels in which it is not a particularly didactic book, and it's not in your face with what it thinks. And I think the scarcity mindset as something that is opposed to, right, like good, healthy, surviving communities is one of those things that's quietly in there, right? Because our main character has been raised from birth in a society to privilege survival over all else with this mindset. But then we get these little glimpses, right, in the, what's the name of the community in the geode? And the community on the island, where she gets glimpses of different ways to do things that aren't based on that. In this sort of, these little islands in this sea of, well, we might need to do cannibalism, like, well, we might need to close the gates, like, and this really intense sort of like survivor ethos. So yeah, that's one of those contrasts in the books that really jumps out at me. Another one that really jumps out at me is, and I don't know what to say about this, but is race in the books? How to say this? So first off, it's just a very interesting, like fully secondary human race system where people notice and see racial characteristics, but none of those characteristics are from our world, right? They're from whatever this other world is. This is, I think, handled it really like well and gets into there are no like binary or essential races, right? But there's this history that has left its marks on things, which I think is really interesting. But kind of going along with that survivor mentality, there is a lot of kind of like background, like quasi-race science, quasi-eugenics in how characters think about race in this world that isn't, at least in the first novel, is not questioned terribly much. And it's one of those weird things that I know Jemisin is extremely aware of, and I know has thought and written about a lot. I was reading, I had this pet theory that this book was influenced by the Elder Scrolls games. I don't know if you know those, like Morrowind particularly is all this society in the shadow of this mountain with this volcano and this agriculture that's learned to like work in the ash and stuff like that. But I found a piece she wrote about Skyrim, which is a different Elder Scrolls game, that was really insightful about how quote unquote races in fantasy video games replicate horrible race science assumptions. And that was actually like, I think at least like 3 or 4 years before the 5th season. So like, this is something she has thought very intentionally about. So it's interesting to me that, at least in this first one, we don't get any of that kind of race science type thinking like directly challenged.
Yeah, well, this is my area. So, yeah, it's really tricky. I know Jemisin was in a real bind writing this world because if you are an author of color and you are writing a world, it is really intensely hard to write race without people making assumptions either way about why you're writing race. Octavia Butler was very frustrated a lot about people's interpretations of race in her books for that reason. We know that Jemisin is absolutely taking on the idea of systemic oppression and racism because of the slur that she specifically chooses to use. The double G slur. So I know that she is aware, obviously she's aware she's doing this on purpose, but I think it was a good move on her part not to have colorism. So she has racism, but not colorism. And I think that's really great because it points out how manufactured race is, that literally you can take anybody of any color, any gender, and turn them into an oppressed, group simply through the systems that you use, the stories that you tell, and fear. And so she brilliantly does that. She doesn't bring in the descriptions of characters until later. She plays around by making Alabaster the darkest character.
Mm-hmm.
So again, she's irreverent that way and she's having fun with it, putting these underlying, sort of signals, but not outright talking about it, which I think really worked. But again, it's tricky because as an academic who studies these things, I want to say, yeah, they're slaves. It's
Mm-hmm.
slavery that we're talking about here. And yet, as somebody who studies race and the history of race, I know it's more complicated than that. And I like that Jemisin made it more complicated than that.
I love that it's sort of left in there as like there are all of these cultural assumptions, even just through the first book, that Essun, slash Sienna, our main character, has to confront, and that like you have taken in this problematic ideology and then stuff in the book makes her confront that. And that the race thinking is not one she has to do. And I kind of like that it's left in there for the reader to kind of take that extra step. That feels like one of those sort of like levels of play the book is doing.
Yeah, I also think though that she does take it on through the family trauma aspect. So she takes it on in the relationship between Essun and Nasun slash Demaya. A lot of the things wrong with her relationship with her daughter stem from the ways that she was raised. And so you've got that trauma that is then passed down that Essun has to deal with throughout the series. And I think there's been a lot of work on awareness about that kind of trauma, especially for Black women. And so I think Jemisin is, being very intentional there.
We've talked like very high level about these social systems of oppression, which, are in the book, these societies that either kill or enslave origins and use their powers to survive. But one of the things that I had forgotten that however many years it's been since I read this was the transparency and the awfulness of the abuse of the guardians,
Mm,
right? And is it Shafa's relationship with Demaya,
yes.
where this just crystal clear psychological manipulation and abuse to generate this system of like control and attachment with a child is just horrifying. So much more horrifying than a lot of the the visceral things that happen later in the book, and that we kind of learn that that guardian relationship sort of comes to stand in for like one of the problems with the whole system.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's one of the interesting things that Jemisin does with the world is one of the reasons why the origins don't just rise up is because you get to them as children.
Mm-hmm.
The communities have been taught to fear them. So when the abilities come out as early as 3, but usually in pre-pubescent, the community turns on them. And so it's a great, it's an interesting way to create a system where the most powerful people will immediately be captured, killed, or enslaved.
And has a lot of fun, like I think, sort of like superhero, like Magneto is right, kind of resonance in there as well. Yeah.
Mm.
Also, before we should take a break here in a sec, but I do want to call out before we move on to other things. I was just so impressed reading this again, just structurally with it,
Mm.
and the way that we have this really engaging world, right? That has lots of problems, lots of adventures, things to go on, but that the first one is setting up these sort of like big reveals of mysteries that it's not clear how they're going to shake out. Like we get how the Guardians work, how the Guardians are connected to the obelisks, what the Stone Eaters are up to. And then the very last line of this book, where you realize that there's no moon here, is just, it's so perfectly timed. And I love how like that is threaded through these more immediate problems that you're thinking about, and even the sort of the sort of higher level social and theoretical problems that you as a reader are picking up on. And all throughout that, it's she's slowly weaving in these really big plot elements that are going to become important later. But I dig that, and it doesn't feel like just a setup. I often get really frustrated when I read like the first book in a series, and I'm like, okay, you're setting everything up. Like this is a complete book. You can totally just read this and be happy. But it is also building all these things in such an intriguing way that I couldn't wait to go on and read the next one.
Oh yeah. No, please. No, everybody read book 2 at least. Because
Yep.
that's where all the reveals start to happen. Yeah. But no, I agree with you. It can be challenging, the structure sometimes. I get that, some readers might not like it for that reason, but I think, science fiction and fantasy readers in particular, we're used to that, and we love mysteries and we love puzzle,
Mm-hmm.
building, world building and putting together a puzzle and a mystery. If you like that, you're going to love this
Mm-hmm.
because, you get these reveals that you're like, oh my goodness, how did I not see that? It's so great. But also, when I went back and read the first couple of lines of this book, it reminded me of Marlon James's Black Leopard, Red Wolf,
Oh. Mm-hmm.
where you specifically use one tragic event at the beginning to destructure the fantasy. Like you can't have a quest if the most terrible thing has happened at the beginning and there's no quest to be had. So I do appreciate that by Jemisin and other authors where they'll set it up to where, from the beginning, you're like, I sort of know how this story ends and, it's not great, but I'm still going to go on the journey.
I've sometimes heard that in mysteries there's the whodunit, but that the why done it can be more
Oh,
fascinating.
yeah, yeah.
Where you kind of know everything that happened, but figuring that out. And yeah, I agree. Starting this quote unquote after the end and
Mm.
not making it a cheap shot is that's a really cool move. I also like reading it this time. Like I'm going to hold this in my back pocket for the perennial show don't tell arguments
Yeah.
because I genuinely think this is really fascinating because
Mm.
like Jemison absolutely is not thinking about that rule and he's just telling lots of stuff. But also you realize as you go on that things that were explicitly told to you, you actually need to question. So the telling is also a showing. Yeah, dug it.
And yeah, it can also be connected to culture because I
Mm,
see a lot of Caribbean fantasy authors playing with that too. There's some great works that start with sort of a once upon a time, but maybe it wasn't a time, but maybe it was a
mm.
time sort of structure. And whenever I see that at the beginning, I automatically know, oh, I'm going to like this.
That's cool. Let's take just a quick break. I'm just going to grab a drink of water and then I want to come back and talk just briefly kind of about what we think this series says about larger trends. All right, we are back. We are still talking about the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin and also the larger trilogy it's part of. And I wanted to ask you, as someone who has been really intensely studying and researching and writing on particularly like newer and 21st century fantasy across a broad swath, what you kind of think this book says about trends in the field, or what do you think about this book sort of as like an emblem of how things are going?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think definitely, you referred back to N.K. Jemisin in 2018 with the sad puppies controversy and then her epic speech that she made. I definitely think that moment sort of it helped and it it also showed authors of color who want to break into speculative fiction just how hard that is.
Mm,
So it sort of did both things. Definitely I know that there are a lot of younger authors who will say in interviews that they saw Jemisin win the Hugo 3 times and it was inspiring and it, really helped them to be able to write what they wanted rather than what they thought they were expected to write. So I think that's one of Jemisin's biggest accomplishments for the field, is that, her example really exposed a lot of the underlying racism and sexism that was still going on. Her speech was so inspiring, but, really called out the bad behavior. And her writing is just so amazing, so pushing the boundaries. I can't think of a lot of examples before the Broken Earth series where authors were really playing with the genre boundaries the way that she was. And I see that a lot more now. So I see a lot more, my research is specific to mostly 21st century authors of color who are writing fantasy fiction right now. But that's really debatable. When we talk about genre distinctions, there's a whole section of my introduction where I have to explain, look, when I say fantasy, I might not mean what you mean when you say fantasy. Because a lot of times, I think this is one of the reasons that Jemisin had fun with this. A lot of times fantasy gets downplayed as less serious than science fiction. And I think one of the reasons that fans were upset at first for book 2 was because she was getting a lot of the hardcore, hard sci-fi fans interested. And then she pulls out the magic. And so I think a lot of times, not only has fantasy been treated as less than sometimes when compared to sci-fi and speculative fiction in general, but also there are, cultural aspects of colonization where, indigenous peoples were labeled as less than because of magical, in quotation marks, beliefs, which has led to this idea that certain cultural and religious practices are magical, like Santeria, Voodoo, things like that. So in the introduction to my book, I just spell out, look, if you're researching fantasy, here's what you have to consider. What is the culture that this book coming from? How do they feel about the term magic? When do they use it? How does the author use it? I think N.K. Jemisin was like a really early rock star in that, where you really sort of had to think through, like, how is this magic system working? Why did she put magic in this book that we all thought was hard sci-fi dystopic future? And it gave other authors permission to do that too, to sort of push boundaries like that. I think her, Octavia Butler and Nnedi Okorafor, really helped push those boundaries. So that's one of the biggest things I see in the field now. I see people who aren't just writing classic Western fantasy with dark skin. I see people are more interested now in taking cultural elements from their cultures, like Ibi Zoboi taking, the Loup-Garou of Haitian culture and incorporating that into her fantasy. I see authors feeling more comfortable doing that. Of course, those authors also have to consider the negative of that, which is, will Western fantasy fans then consider that folklore magic? So there's a fine line that you've got to walk. And I think N.K. Jemisin had a lot of barriers in her writing that she managed to overcome just by, being brilliant. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of her work, and I definitely see the impact on younger authors and up and coming authors and indie authors, all sort of finding ways to express themselves, even if they don't get on the New York Times bestseller list.
Two things. One, just a little thing. I think you're so right to identify this as a turning point in the fantasy versus hard science fiction being taken seriously, or if not a turning point, at least a high point or proof that it's really established. And I've been thinking a lot about, specifically in the award scene and in the sort of like bestseller scenes in the books we talk about seriously, how that hard science fiction as like the one real literature we should all be reading and writing has really come down a lot. I think that's a positive thing. It hasn't gone away. It's still out there and you can read it. But the other thing, and I don't I don't have anything super clever to say here, but I'm really fascinated to have you point out that problem of categorizing fantasy, categorizing quote unquote magic. And that goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning about like that love of categorizing, that love of finding the genre. And it's something I think about a lot when I'm reviewing or when I'm editing other people's reviews, and we're trying to read globally and we're trying to read people from cultures we might not be familiar and new authors, debut authors, that there's this real problem with that desire to slot things into these like two commercial things that are called science fiction, which is based on like what's possible, and fantasy, which is all made up magic, right? And once you start running into things like, magical realism coming out of this very different cultural and political discourse, right? Or coming into things like whether it's Afrofuturism or African futurism or Afro-Jujuism, all these different terminologies for things that are not thinking about it as just like a made-up wizard world, right? And thinking differently about how what we might broadly call it. I don't even love this term now. I've been trying irrealism on for size as like sort of a stand-in for some of these. When we're talking about, we know we're not talking about quote unquote normal, like mimetic literature. But even that doesn't quite work, because if you're saying it's not normal, it's not quote unquote realism that we're doing here. That's problematic when you might be talking about a tradition that is thinking about it differently and not thinking about it as not real.
Yeah.
I don't know if I don't have anything clever to say about that, but it's something I think about a lot. So,
Well, yeah, it's a huge, it's an issue for academics. If you're a fan and you love to read what you love. But for us academics, when you go to a conference, man, I'm actually going to be speaking. I've been invited to speak at the Latinx Visions Conference, which is specifically a conference about Latinx speculative fiction. And in Latino studies in particular, this has been a huge issue because magical realism for the longest time was the acceptable literature to study, and it was not fantasy.
right.
There's a hard line between magical realism and fantasy, and yet now authors are starting to blur those distinctions. But it's problematic. We don't want to say that magical realism is like fantasy and just like shoehorn it in. But also we don't want to say, well, I can't study speculative fiction because I studied magical realism.
Right.
So, in particular in graduate studies, I want to encourage students to think across these genres in order to get some really interesting takes on things. So when I do my talk, it will start with a short primer of, look, this is how I'm looking at magical realism. This is fantasy. This is science fiction. But there are authors that are going to mess with all of that. There are literally short stories where you're not even sure if the magical thing that happens actually happened. So then which category are we putting it in? Or did they call it magic? So yes, those genre distinctions are important in some ways because we don't want to miscategorize something if it's harmful to the community that ends up getting miscategorized. And I think, Nnedi Okorafor, that's why she came up with African futurism and African Jujuism, because her work was so often being misrepresented as fantastical rather than science fiction, which she felt she was writing. And she was writing, not just that she felt that she was writing it, but people who didn't understand the culture were making assumptions about her work. She didn't like that. And she pushed back by creating her own terminology. So yes, it's a sticky wicket for those people who study it. But I think in terms of, just the fandom, I don't think the distinction should matter as much. I think people should encourage authors to go cross genre. And yeah, let us academics argue at conferences.
Totally. But I'm also fascinated by it as, as a non-academic who's like engaged in a lot of different reading spaces and reading communities where we have these sort of like received ways of reading and responding to things that come out of this very like cut and dry, right? Like sci-fi fantasy kind of things, like, here's where it goes on the shelf at the bookstore. But then you get really successful work that is messing with those boundaries in really interesting ways. And then I think about like how that's being received and talked about in those communities. And like, the fifth season is one example that's really messing with genre. But to bring it back around to some of this other stuff we're talking about, I think of like, Marlon James books, which are on the one hand, right, like just totally fantasy, right? Like they're quest narratives. But on the other hand, are not and are doing this very different thing, with like this high literary engagement with a lot of other traditions that a lot of, not making fun of anyone, but kind of like middle of the road, Tolkien readers probably aren't familiar with. But that got really successful, right? Or I'm thinking of things like Marianna Enriquez's work, right? Who's like winning like major non-genre awards. Did you read Craft, Ananda Lima's collection?
I did not.
Oh my gosh, get that on your list.
Okay.
Which is like, I say collection, but like with a big asterisk, because it has a lot of connective tissue that make me like, I don't quite know what to call it, but it's definitely like, it's published by Tor, Brazilian poet originally, has been most of her work prior. And it's doing a lot of this stuff where I'm like, oh, like I want to call this magical realism or a slipstream. I'm not quite sure what to call it. It's great. And I don't want to get bogged down in what the definitions are, but it does make me think a lot about how it's working with all of these traditions that aren't just make-believe in the way that, traditional commercial fantasy has been defined. And having more and more people working in different ways with it, I think, I don't know, it blurs those generic lines out of the imaginary into more of the real world in ways that I think are very fruitful and interesting. And so how we talk about it is also something I'm interested in, which was a big long-winded thing. But
no, that's really a good point. I do like that you brought up this sort of high literature, writing versus speculative writing versus, again, for years, pulp writing. And we have these assumptions that we make about high literature versus speculative fiction versus pulp, and I think authors are doing some really cool things with that. Marlon James, Colson, Whitehead, Amal, El-Mohtar. They're all like showing us, that science fiction and fantasy can really do some new cool things, can be written in a high literary style and still work as genre fiction. But also, what I really love is the opposite. So my next project is going to be on Nghi and her Singing Hill cycle, because I love that Nghi is unabashedly the opposite. She's like, I write for money, and I am going to keep writing these novellas because people want to read them and people will pay me to write them. And that a couple decades ago would have been considered like, the little fantasy books that you get in the supermarket. Like, it would have been considered like in that vein. But now people are reading them and loving them and taking them seriously. And so I just love that, there's choice there, that authors can go in both of those directions and be taken seriously. And we've got less of this talk of pulp and this type of writing being for, juvenile or being for, not serious readers. So I do love that. As a pure fan of science fiction and fantasy, I see the shift in where like people are not ashamed to admit that they read certain things now, which I'm absolutely loving, because I grew up a total nerd and I think everybody should be participating in nerddom. I think it should be for everybody. So I would love to see more of that, more authors sort of pushing those boundaries of, what category does this fit in?
That's fantastic. I love that. I love bringing in Nghi too. And I want to shout out The City in Glass, which I wanted to thread into the conversation earlier, but I think it's a great sort of, even though it's a tight little novel, it's fantastic. I think it feels very in the tradition of whatever the fifth season is, with its mix of anger and hope and doing some really cool world building. But just want to shout that out. Joy, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Thank you for coming on and talking about this. Before we go, is there anything you are working on or have coming up you want to shout out or tell people where they can find your work?
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you for having me. I've had so much fun. I love talking about these things, and I don't get to do it enough. People can find me professionally. I'm on Blue Sky now. At Sanchez-Taylor.bsky.social. I think I've talked about most of the things I'm doing. My next project, which is going to be a companion, a teaching companion for Nevo's Singing Hill Cycle.
That's so cool.
So I'm excited because I think her books would be they're already fantastic. I know people teaching them, but I want people to have a resource to understand just how fabulous that collection actually is. Now she just has to stop writing them so that I can keep up. But also, I'll be doing a panel on conjuring with a couple of really cool authors, Suzan Palumbo, Zigzag Claybourne, and I'm blanking on the other name, and I'm sorry to the author, but I'll be doing that at the virtual conference for the Fantastic in the Arts. And then I will actually be at the World Fantasy Convention, yay, at the end of October, beginning of November, promoting Dispelling Fantasies. So if you're in the UK, come and see me.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, if listeners don't know the International Conference on the Fantastic on the Arts, it's really fantastic, and it's no pun intended, and it's a great mix of like multidisciplinary scholars and writers are there. It's just a very cool energy, and now they're doing a virtual thing. I think they're going to do that most years, I think, is the plan.
They've started. Yeah, this is, I think, the third or fourth year they've been doing it virtually. You know, I love virtual conferences for the access. I love getting to see people in person, too, which is why I'm going to the World Fantasy Convention. But in terms of access, you know, it is really important to also have virtual conferences for people.
I also really love that they're not doing it at the same time, that they like space it out. So you're not like people who are going aren't juggling it. So you can kind of get everyone there. I think that's great.
And for fans, we're going to be running some charity online games that people can actually participate in, and they can help out Black, Indigenous, people of color scholars that are entering the study of science fiction and fantasy work, and also underrepresented and underfunded academics and authors.
Fantastic. I will look up some links to that and include that in the show notes. So yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, hope to do this again sometime. Hope to run into you at a conference or something.
Yeah, maybe in a few years. I'll stay in my pajamas writing the next project until then. But no, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
A Meal of Thorns is a podcast from the Ancillary Review of Books, an online magazine founded to address the radical possibilities of criticism with a focus on speculative fiction, world literature, and utopian impulses. Go to ancillaryreviewofbooks.org for regular reviews, essays, interviews, and more. Our opening poem is by Bartra Hari, translated by John Bruff. Our music is by Giselle Gabriel Garcia. Our artwork is by Rob Patterson at The Ratio Farm. Thanks to our human transcribers, Kate Dollarhyde and John W.M. Thompson. They are diligently working on getting us caught up on our transcriptions. If you'd like to support the podcast and the Ancillary Review of Books, that is rad. A few different ways you can do that. Join our Patreon. A couple dollars a month really moves us towards our sustainability and contributor paying goals. You can hang out with us on Discord, and we've got a couple other goodies in the works. If you're interested in a book we mention, buying from the bookshop link in our show notes or at the ARB website gets us a cut, and it helps us immensely if you just help get the word out about the show. Leaving us a review, commenting, or sharing on your platform of choice, that really helps. And it's nice to know you're listening. Questions, suggestions, pedantic notes about things we got wrong? Drop us an email at mealofthorns@gmail.com. And you can follow us on Blue Sky for periodic skeets, I guess. Did that term stick? All right, next time we are going back to 1993 to Melissa Scott's Burning Bright, talking about that with Ursula Witcher. After that, we've got some fun stuff coming up, going sideways, going some different directions. Check the website if you want to read ahead. Thanks for listening as always, and stay critical out there.